I remember the day clearly, the kind of clear autumn morning when the light feels crisp and every breath of cold air fills your lungs with a mix of excitement and unease. I had planned this hiking trip for months, meticulously mapping out a route through a remote section of the Northern Highlands. It was supposed to be a simple journey, a test of my endurance and a time to reflect on life. Instead, it turned into an ordeal I will never forget. I had left my small town early that morning with a backpack loaded with essentials: water, some dried food, a first aid kit, and a thick map that I had studied for weeks. The trailhead was located near a winding country road, and the forest beyond it promised solitude and the raw beauty of nature. I remember how the trees stood tall and silent as I began my trek, their leaves turning gold and red with the early hints of fall. The path was well-trodden at first, the ground soft with fallen leaves and the distant sound of a burbling stream keeping time with my footsteps. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sound of civilization faded into nothingness. The chirps of birds and the rustle of small animals became my only companions. I felt a deep connection to the earth beneath my boots and the towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Every so often, I would pause to admire the quiet beauty around me. A cluster of wildflowers clinging to life on a rocky outcrop, a squirrel darting along the branch of an ancient oak, or the way the light played across the forest floor in shifting patterns. However, as the day wore on, the trail began to twist unexpectedly. What was once a clearly marked path grew narrow and indistinct. I found myself relying on the map and my sense of direction, noticing that familiar landmarks were suddenly absent. The forest seemed to have a mind of its own. The trees, once welcoming, now loomed over me like silent judges. I kept telling myself that it was just a part of the wilderness's nature to be unpredictable, but a nagging doubt began to creep in. Had I taken a wrong turn somewhere? Or was the trail simply merging into the wild expanse of the forest? I pressed on, my pace quickening as the uncertainty of my direction built an uneasy tension in my chest. The undergrowth grew thicker, and the once clear path became a barely visible track that I had to search for between dense clusters of brush and fallen logs. Every step was taken with caution, and my mind raced with thoughts of getting hopelessly lost. I kept checking my map, trying to line up the features of the land with what I had seen before, but the forest seemed to shift and change with every bend. Around midday, I reached a clearing by a small stream. I decided to take a short break, hoping that a moment of calm would help me reorient. I sat on a smooth rock at the water's edge, watching the clear water flow over pebbles and listening to its gentle murmur. I filled my water bottle, took a few deep breaths, and allowed myself a brief respite from the tension that had been steadily building. I thought about how many hikes I had taken before, each one teaching me something about my own limits and the unpredictable character of nature. But this time, something felt different. A subtle warning in the whisper of the wind, a sudden chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground. After my break, I resumed my journey with a cautious optimism. I decided to head in the direction the stream flowed, thinking that it might lead me back to a more familiar route. The path followed the water, winding through groves of firs and pines, until I came upon a section of the trail that was nearly impassable. Large boulders and thick roots crisscrossed the way, forcing me to navigate carefully. I remember the strain in my muscles and the tightening in my chest as I stepped over a particularly large rock, the uneven surface testing my balance on the damp, slippery ground. The further I traveled, the more I realized that the forest had become almost claustrophobic. The trees crowded together so tightly that they blocked out the sky, and a heavy mist began to settle over everything. The visibility dropped suddenly, and I found myself enveloped in a fog that made every shape and shadow seem ominous. My heart pounded in my ears as I slowed my pace, each step measured and deliberate. The mist felt thick and cold, as if the air itself was warning me to turn back, yet I continued forward, driven by a stubborn need to find my way. Time lost its meaning as the day slipped into a gray, featureless afternoon. I kept walking, guided only by instinct and the faint trail markers that still occasionally appeared on trees and rocks. The landscape around me was both beautiful and intimidating, a silent wilderness that seemed indifferent to my presence. I took notice of every sound: the crunch of dried leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig that made me flinch, and the relentless hum of the wind weaving through the trees. At one point, I came upon a steep slope that led upwards into a rocky ridge. The climb was grueling, and the path was littered with loose stones that threatened every step. I remember gripping the coarse bark of a tree for support as I carefully made my way up, my arms trembling with the effort. It was there, on that narrow, precarious trail, that I first felt a profound sense of vulnerability, a realization that nature was an indifferent force, one that could humble even the most experienced of hikers in an instant. By late afternoon, I had reached a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the forest below. The sight was breathtaking. The patchwork of trees in brilliant autumn hues stretched out to the horizon, interlaced with the silver thread of a winding river. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope, as if the view itself were a sign that I was on the right track. I allowed myself to linger, absorbing the scene and trying to rekindle the initial joy that had fueled my journey. Yet, as I began to retrace my steps, I realized that the path back down was not as clear as I had assumed. The same fog that had blanketed the lower forest had now crept up the slopes, obscuring the very markers I had come to rely on. Nightfall crept upon me without warning. I was still high on that ridge, the temperature dropping rapidly as darkness swallowed the landscape. I knew I had to find shelter soon. With no clear path in sight and the biting cold settling in, I chose a small, relatively flat area near a cluster of rocks to set up camp. I gathered some dry twigs and leaves, building a modest fire to ward off the chill. The flames cast flickering shadows on the rocks, and for a few precious hours, I allowed myself to feel safe, sitting close to the warmth while the wilderness around me slumbered. Lying on my sleeping pad, I stared up at the starless sky through gaps in the heavy canopy. The crackle of the fire and the low hum of the forest were my only companions. My thoughts swirled as I replayed the day's events, the uncertainty of my path, and the growing sense of isolation. I thought about how I had always felt at home in nature, yet here, on this lonely ridge, I was confronted with its raw, unfiltered power. The fire eventually died down, leaving me with only the glow of embers and the haunting rustle of leaves in the cold wind. When I awoke in the early hours of the next morning, the mist had thickened into a dense fog that blanketed everything. My camp, once a temporary refuge, now felt like a fragile island in a sea of uncertainty. I bundled up in layers, checked my supplies, and decided to press on, hoping that the morning light would eventually break through the gloom. Every step was slow and cautious as I navigated over uneven ground, my eyes straining to detect any sign of the trail. The silence was profound. There were no birds, no rustling animals, only the sound of my own breathing and the distant, persistent murmur of water somewhere below. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs heavy and my mind racing with worry. At one point, I stumbled upon what looked like a washed-out section of the trail. The ground was muddy and unstable, the remains of a recent heavy rain perhaps exacerbated by the melting frost of the night. I paused, examining the terrain carefully before deciding on the safest route forward. Every detail mattered: the angle of a rock, the depth of a puddle, the slight incline of a hidden path between the trees. I felt an acute awareness of how fragile life was in these wild spaces, where one misstep could lead to injury or worse. The weather began to shift abruptly. The fog lifted only to be replaced by a low, rolling cloud of rain that turned the trail into a slick and treacherous path. The sound of raindrops on leaves and the constant patter on my jacket provided a rhythmic, almost hypnotic background as I trudged along. My clothes quickly became soaked, and I could feel the chill seeping into my bones, intensifying the sense of isolation. I had to take extra care not to slip on the wet stones, and each step became a battle against the slippery ground. The cold rain blurred my vision and made every sound seem magnified, creating an atmosphere of heightened alertness and underlying dread. During a brief pause under the shelter of an overhanging rock, I took stock of my situation. My water supply was dwindling, my food was sparse, and my map, once a reliable guide, was becoming less useful in the ever-changing terrain. I realized that I was now truly alone in a place where nature ruled without mercy. Every instinct in me told me I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the silence of the forest, the sound of your own breath, and the feeling of being completely alone in the wilderness that makes everything feel real. No distractions, no noise from the world outside. Just you, your thoughts, and the trail ahead. That's what I was looking for when I decided to take on a remote trail in the mountains, miles away from any town or people. I had read about it online. An old, overgrown path that hadn't been used in years, but one that supposedly led to an incredible view at the top of a ridge. I wanted to see it for myself. The morning was perfect. The sun was out, the air was crisp but not too cold, and the forest was alive with the sound of birds and distant rustling in the underbrush. I had my backpack loaded with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a basic first aid kit. Everything I thought I needed for a long day hike. I parked my car at a small dirt pull-off, checked my phone one last time, no signal, as expected, and set off onto the trail. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but still visible, though it was clear that not many people had come this way in a long time. Bushes had started creeping in, fallen branches lay across the path, and in some places, I had to push through thick undergrowth just to stay on track. But that was part of the adventure. I liked the feeling of being somewhere few had been before. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. It wasn't an abrupt silence, just a slow realization that the usual sounds of birds and insects had faded away. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. Just the wind shifting through the trees. That was normal, I told myself. Animals move on. Birds fly to different spots, no big deal. But there was something unsettling about it, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook it off and kept going. The trail got rougher as I climbed higher. Roots jutted out like traps waiting to snag my boots, and the incline was steep enough that my legs started burning. I liked the challenge. It made me feel alive. But there was still that silence. No birds, no rustling. Just the crunch of my boots on dirt and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. That's when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A few feet ahead, there was a small clearing where the trail widened slightly before continuing up the ridge. In the middle of it was a backpack, just sitting there, half unzipped, with some clothes and a water bottle spilling out onto the ground. It looked old, weathered like it had been there for a long time, but there were no signs of a camp, no tent, no fire pit. Just the pack, abandoned. I hesitated. Maybe a hiker had lost it, but that didn't make sense. Who just loses a backpack in the middle of nowhere and doesn't come back for it? I stepped closer and nudged it with my foot. No response, no sound. It wasn't buried under leaves or dirt, which meant it hadn't been there too long. A few weeks, maybe a month at most, but still no sign of anyone nearby. I glanced around. The trees pressed in close on all sides, thick and uninviting. I couldn't see far in any direction. The longer I stood there, the worse it felt. Like I wasn't supposed to be there, like something was watching me from the trees, just beyond where I could see. I told myself I was being paranoid, but my gut was screaming at me to move. I stepped around the backpack and kept going. The trail got worse from there, steeper, more overgrown. Several times, I had to stop and double-check that I was still on the right path. The forest felt heavier, like the air was pressing down on me. And then I saw it, the second thing that made me realize I'd made a mistake coming here. A jacket, tattered, faded, snagged on a branch, like someone had been running and it got caught. I stopped, staring at it. There was something wrong with the way it hung there, like it had been left in a hurry. My stomach twisted. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I should have turned around right then. I should have taken the hint, but I was stubborn. I had come this far and I wanted to reach that ridge, so I pressed on. The forest was closing in around me now. The trees were thicker, the light dimmer even though it was still midday. My breathing felt too loud. Every sound I made seemed amplified, like I was the only thing making noise for miles. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something, standing there, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Then I heard it, a sound up ahead, faint but clear, a crunch, like a footstep. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waited, barely breathing. Another crunch, closer, and then nothing. Silence again. But this time it was worse, because now I knew I wasn't alone. I turned around and started walking back, fast. My mind was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to keep a steady pace. Running would make noise. Running would attract attention. I needed to get back to my car, but the trail looked different now. The way the branches twisted overhead, the way the undergrowth seemed thicker. Had I really come this way? My footprints were gone. The dirt looked untouched, like no one had walked here at all. Panic started to creep in, but I shoved it down. Keep going, keep moving, don't stop. Then, ahead on the trail, I saw the backpack. The same backpack I had passed earlier. The same one. But I had walked straight. I hadn't turned around. So how was it in front of me? I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. I had walked in a straight line. I hadn't looped back. But there it was, sitting in the middle of the trail just like before. And then I heard the crunch of a footstep. Right behind me. I ran. I didn't care about noise anymore. I didn't care about anything except getting out. Branches tore at my clothes. My boots slipped on loose dirt, but I didn't stop. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. I don't know how long I ran, but suddenly I saw it, daylight through the trees. The road, my car. I burst out of the forest, gasping for air, and practically threw myself at the driver's side door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the lock. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I tore out of there, speeding down the dirt road until I hit pavement, then didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what happened in that forest. I don't know why I saw what I did, or how the trail twisted on me like that. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. The terrain of life. I always hiked alone. Something about the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being deep in the woods where no one could find me. It was peaceful, but that trip changed everything. It made me realize how small I really was out there, how little control I had when nature decided to turn against me. I had planned a 3-day solo hike through the mountains. It wasn't my first time, far from it. I had spent years doing solo trips, pushing myself further, harder. I packed everything I needed: my tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, extra socks, a first aid kit. I double-checked my gear and set out early in the morning, following a trail that wound through dense forest before climbing up towards the ridgeline. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sky clear. The trail was empty, just how I liked it. I made good time, reaching my planned campsite by late afternoon. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. That night, I slept deeply. I was used to the sounds of the forest, branches creaking, wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional distant snap of a twig. But when I woke up the next morning, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just an eerie stillness. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just one of those strange mornings. I packed up my gear and continued on the trail, climbing higher into the mountains. The higher I went, the rougher the terrain became. The trail narrowed, the trees thinned out. Jagged rock faces loomed overhead, casting long shadows. The sun was warm, but I couldn't shake the cold feeling in my gut. By midday, I reached a section of the trail that required some scrambling. Nothing extreme, just careful foot placement and slow, deliberate movements. I was about halfway up when I saw it. A backpack, half buried under a pile of loose rock. It was old, torn in places, the fabric faded from the sun. I hesitated, then climbed closer. The straps were frayed, the zippers rusted. I nudged it with my boot, and a small cloud of dust puffed up. It had been here for a long time. I crouched down, carefully unzipping the main compartment. Inside, there was a water bottle, long emptied, a moldy granola bar, and a crumpled up map. I pulled the map out and unfolded it, my eyes scanning the markings. Someone had circled a spot further along the trail, past the ridgeline. I traced the path with my finger. It wasn't too far from where I was planning to camp that night. I debated leaving the backpack, but something about it unsettled me. Someone had left it here, abandoned. Had they fallen? Gotten lost? I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone, just silence and stone. I kept moving. The rest of the climb was uneventful, but the feeling in my gut only grew stronger. By late afternoon, I reached the ridgeline. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills, endless forest, a sky so vast it made me feel like an ant. I found a flat spot and set up camp. As I was boiling water for dinner, I pulled out the map again. The circled spot was just a short hike away. I had enough daylight left to check it out. Leaving my heavier gear behind, I grabbed my headlamp, knife, and water bottle, then followed the rough, unmarked path towards the marked location. The trees were thicker here, twisted and gnarled. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and loose stones. Felt different from the rest of the hike, wilder, untouched. I pushed forward, scanning the forest for any sign of... Well, I didn't know what I was looking for. Then I saw it. A tent, collapsed, torn at the seams. It looked like it had been there for years. The fabric was stiff with dirt. The poles snapped. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Scattered around the site were bits of clothing, a rusted camping stove, a pair of boots so caked in mud they looked fused to the ground. My throat tightened. Whoever had been here hadn't packed up and left. They had abandoned everything. I crouched down, brushing away leaves and debris. Underneath the tent's remains, I found a notebook. The pages were damp, some stuck together, but I could still make out some of the writing. The handwriting was shaky, rushed. Something is following me. I read the words again. My body went cold. Flipping through the pages, I found more. Short entries, scribbled hastily. I hear it at night. Footsteps, too heavy for an animal. I woke up and my food was gone. No sign of animals. I'm not alone out here. The footsteps are getting closer. The last entry was smudged, the ink smeared from moisture, but I could still make out the words. It's outside my tent. I sat back, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It had to be an animal, maybe paranoia, a lost hiker, scared and alone, convincing themselves of something that wasn't there. But then where were they? I stood up, suddenly very aware of how deep I was into the forest. The sun was dipping lower, shadows stretching long across the ground. I needed to get back to my camp. I turned, moving quickly but carefully, every snap of a twig making my skin crawl. My headlamp cast long beams through the trees as the sky darkened. The moment my tent came into view, I exhaled sharply, relief washing over me. But that relief vanished the second I saw my campsite. My gear had been moved, not torn apart, not scattered like an animal had rifled through it. Moved. My sleeping bag was unrolled, my backpack opened. My food bag, which I had tied up in a tree to keep away from bears, was now lying on the ground. I stared, my pulse hammering. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not from the trail. From the trees. I turned, my headlamp cutting through the dark. Nothing, just trees. But I knew I wasn't alone. I grabbed my knife, backing towards my tent. My mind screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay still, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside my tent, knife in hand, every sound making me jump. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up and left, moving as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I never reported it. What would I even say? There was no proof, no evidence. Just a torn-up tent, an old notebook, and a feeling in my gut that still hasn't gone away. I haven't hiked alone since. I don't know what made me choose that trail. I had plenty of options. Easier ones, well-traveled ones that wouldn't leave me out in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the sound of my own breath and the crunch of dead leaves underfoot. But I wanted something more remote, something that would make me feel like I was truly alone in nature. I got my wish. The trail didn't even have an official name, at least not one listed on any of the park maps. I'd read about it online, mentioned in hushed tones in some forum post from years ago. A path that had been there long before the park was officially mapped out, known only to those who had wandered far enough to find it. I had set out early in the morning, the air still thick with the dampness of the previous night's rain. The first few miles were uneventful. Birds called to each other in the distance. A light breeze rustled the trees, and the earthy scent of wet soil filled my lungs. I followed the trail deeper, noting how it gradually became narrower, the trees pressing in closer. The further I walked, the quieter it got. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I should have turned back then, but I told myself it was fine. I had a map, a compass, and my GPS. I wasn't lost, just off the beaten path. Then I saw it. A clearing ahead, sunlight filtering through the gaps in the trees. But as I stepped forward, my boots sank into something soft. Mud, thick and dark, clinging to my shoes, pulling me down just slightly. I cursed under my breath and took another step. The mud gave way again, this time deeper. I struggled to pull my foot free, my balance shifting uncomfortably. I forced myself forward, heart hammering now. Then I saw something, a shape partially buried in the mud a few feet ahead. At first, I thought it was just a fallen branch, but as I moved closer, the details became clearer. A backpack, old, torn, coated in dirt and decay. I hesitated, every instinct in my body telling me to turn around. But curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down, using a stick to prod at the fabric. The zipper had rusted shut, the fabric stiff with age. This pack had been here for a long time. And then I noticed the bone, just barely visible through the mud. A jagged, pale shard of something that shouldn't be there. I felt a cold sweat break over my skin. My mind scrambled for explanations. An animal? Maybe. But deep down, I knew better. I straightened up fast, heart pounding. I needed to leave. Now, I turned back the way I came, walking faster than I should have. My breathing grew shallow, each sound in the forest now sharp and too distinct. The wind in the trees, the rustling leaves, the distant sound of something moving. I checked my GPS. Nothing. My phone's battery was fine, but the map refused to load. The blue dot that was supposed to mark my position was frozen. I looked up. The trees all looked the same now. The path I had followed so easily just an hour ago now seemed less distinct, swallowed by the forest. I tried retracing my steps, but something felt off. No matter which way I turned, the trees seemed to shift, the path twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The ground felt softer under my feet, the dampness sinking in. And then the smell hit me. Rot. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the scent of wet leaves and earth. But it grew stronger, thick and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat. My stomach churned. I pushed forward, forcing myself to ignore it, to ignore the way my brain screamed at me that something was wrong, very wrong. Then the footprints, not mine. They were ahead of me, leading off the trail, barely visible in the mud. Deep, like someone had been running. I stopped, staring at them, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't old. The edges were crisp, fresh. I wasn't alone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Long enough for the sky to darken slightly, the light shifting. I forced myself to move, this time more carefully. I didn't call out. I didn't want to know who else was out here. I walked fast, keeping my eyes on the ground, searching for any sign of my own footprints, some marker that would lead me back. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone else had been here recently. Maybe they got lost just like me. But then why hadn't I seen them? The footprints veered off, disappearing into the underbrush. I wasn't going to follow them. I focused on moving forward. Then, a sound. A sharp, snapping branch too close. I whipped around. Nothing. The trees stood still, silent. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't alone. I started moving faster. My breath came quicker now, chest tight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running meant panic. Running meant mistakes. Then, up ahead, something shifted. A shape, tall, unmoving, just barely visible between the trees. My blood turned to ice. I took a step back, my foot sinking into the mud again. I didn't breathe. The figure didn't move. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, forcing myself to keep my pace steady. Don't run. Don't look back. Minutes stretched into eternity. The forest pressed in, the silence unbearable. Then, finally, I saw it, the broken tree, the one I had passed hours ago. My trail. Relief flooded me, but I didn't slow down. I kept moving, practically jogging now. The woods felt lighter, the trees less dense. And then, finally, the parking lot. My car. I didn't look back. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled away, my eyes flicked to the tree line, just for a second. And in that second, I saw movement. Something or someone standing just beyond the trees, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I drove, and I never went back. I had been hiking alone for years. It was something I loved. Being out in the wilderness, far from everything, just me and nature. The silence, the fresh air, the feeling of complete isolation. It was all I needed to reset. I had done long-distance hikes, solo camping trips, even spent weeks alone in remote areas. So when I set out for a multi-day hike in a deep, forested valley I had never been to before, I wasn't worried. I had done my research, packed everything I needed, and planned my route carefully. But I learned the hard way that you can never prepare for everything. The valley was tucked away in a lesser-known part of the state, a place not many people visited. I had found it through an old map, a trail that barely showed up on any modern guides. That was part of the appeal. No tourists, no crowds, just raw wilderness. The first day was uneventful. I made my way through dense trees, the canopy thick enough to keep the sun out. The air smelled damp, rich with earth and pine. I found a good spot to set up camp before nightfall, cooked a simple meal, and settled in. That night, I heard something. It wasn't an animal sound, not the usual rustling or distant howls. It was faint, almost like breathing, but it wasn't mine. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way the wind moved through the trees. Still, it took me a while to fall asleep. The next day, I hiked deeper into the valley. The terrain became rougher, the trail harder to follow. It was obvious this place hadn't been used in years. Occasionally, I would spot old trail markers, weathered and almost completely overtaken by moss. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the forest seemed off. Not in a supernatural way, just a deep, unsettling wrongness. The silence was heavier. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just me and the trees. By late afternoon, I realized I had veered off course. My GPS wasn't getting a signal, but I wasn't too worried. I had my map, my compass, and I was experienced enough to find my way back. I adjusted my path, aiming for a small stream I had passed earlier. As I walked, I saw something ahead, a small wooden structure, barely visible through the trees. It was an old cabin, almost hidden by the overgrowth. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on dead leaves. The place was falling apart. The wood was rotted, the windows were broken, and the door hung open slightly. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. Still, I felt like I was being watched. I scanned the area, but I was alone. I shouldn't have gone inside, but I did. The floor creaked under my weight. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of decay. There wasn't much. An old table, a few rusted tools, a chair missing a leg. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A backpack. It was sitting in the corner, covered in dust. but it wasn't as old as everything else. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. I nudged it with my boot. It wasn't empty. Slowly, I unzipped it. Inside, there were clothes, a flashlight, some food wrappers. Everything looked like it had been there for months, maybe years. Then I found a notebook. I flipped through it. Most of the pages were ruined by moisture, but I could still make out some writing. It wasn't a journal, at least not a normal one. The sentences were short, frantic. They watch at night. No way out. I hear them breathing. It didn't make sense. I felt a deep chill settle in my gut. Who had left this? Where were they now? My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I did. I practically ran out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I needed to get back on track, find my way out of this valley. I moved fast, pushing through thick undergrowth. But the further I went, the more I felt like something was wrong. The trees looked different, the landscape unfamiliar. I checked my map, my compass. Neither helped. I wasn't where I thought I was. The sun was setting. I didn't want to spend another night out here, but I had no choice. I found a small clearing and set up my tent. As darkness fell, the fear settled in deeper. Every sound made me jump. The wind howled through the trees, carrying something with it. Something too rhythmic, too steady. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. They were distant but growing closer. Not an animal, not the wind. Something walking, slow, deliberate. My tent fabric felt too thin, too fragile. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. Then silence. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No wind. Just a dead, suffocating stillness. I didn't sleep. I sat there, knife in hand, every nerve in my body on fire. The night stretched on forever. When the first hint of dawn broke, I packed up and moved. I didn't stop. I walked, climbed, pushed through miles of forest, not caring if I was heading in the right direction, just needing to get out. Hours passed, and then, finally, I saw something ahead. A road, a real paved road. Relief crashed over me so hard I nearly collapsed. I never found out who left that backpack. Never found out what those footsteps were. I don't need to know. I won't go back. Some places aren't meant to be found. I don't know why I went alone. I don't even know why I chose that trail. It wasn't my usual route, and I wasn't familiar with it beyond a few online reviews. I just needed to get away for a bit, clear my head, escape the constant noise of life. Hiking always helped with that. It was late afternoon when I parked my car at the small gravel lot near the entrance of the trail. No other cars were there. I hesitated for a second, wondering if that was a bad sign, but I convinced myself it would be nice to have the solitude. I had my backpack with water, a flashlight, a lighter, a knife, some granola bars, and my phone. I made sure it was fully charged before I left. The first part of the trail was easy. The path was well-trodden, and the air smelled fresh with pine and damp earth. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the silence aside from the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, but I wasn't worried. I had at least a couple of hours before it got dark. My plan was to hike up to a viewpoint, rest for a while, and then head back down before nightfall. About an hour in, the trail started to change. The dirt path became narrower, and the trees pressed in closer. I noticed that the ground was uneven, scattered with exposed roots and loose rocks. I slowed down to watch my footing. There were no more signs marking the way, but the path was still clear enough. I kept going. Then I saw something that made me stop. A shoe, just one, lying on the side of the path. It was dirty, a hiking boot, but it didn't look like it had been there for too long. I frowned, glancing around. No sign of anyone. Maybe someone lost it? I stepped past it, trying not to think too much about it. As I walked, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a nagging feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet now. No birds, no rustling, just my footsteps and my breathing. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. I pressed on. Another 20 minutes passed, and then I saw it. Another shoe, not the same one as before. This one was different, smaller, like it belonged to a child. It was partially buried under some leaves, as if someone had kicked it aside. I stopped walking. My skin prickled. What were the chances of finding two random shoes on the same trail? I pulled out my phone and checked for service. Nothing. No bars. That wasn't too surprising. I was pretty deep in the woods. Still, the unease was growing in my chest. I kept walking, but I was more alert now. My footsteps felt too loud in the silence. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the trees. Then I found the backpack. It was torn open like it had been slashed. The contents were scattered. Some trail mix, an empty water bottle, a ripped jacket. My stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just someone forgetting their stuff. Something had happened here. I turned around. I needed to go back. I walked faster, my heart beat loud in my ears. The trees looked different now, like they were leaning in. My own breathing felt too sharp. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself that I was just scaring myself for no reason. Then I heard it. A branch snapped, not behind me, off to the side in the trees. I stopped, every muscle in my body tensed. I stared into the woods, but I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows. I waited. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was just the wind. But the air was still and no other sounds followed. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. I wasn't running yet, but I wanted to. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out. My feet pounded the dirt path, faster now, but not full-on sprinting. I just needed to reach the parking lot. Then another sound, closer this time. A rustling, something moving. I glanced back, and for a split second, I thought I saw something between the trees. A shape, person. I ran. I didn't care about making noise anymore. I didn't care about twisting my ankle on a root or tripping over a rock. I just ran. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I didn't stop. Then I saw the shoe again. The first one. I had gone in a circle. My heart nearly stopped. That wasn't possible. I had been following the path back the same way I came. I was sure of it. But here it was, the same shoe, lying in the dirt, exactly where I had seen it before. I kept running. I didn't know what else to do. My only thought was to keep moving, to keep going. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Finally, I saw the break in the trees. The parking lot. My car. I sprinted the last stretch, fumbled for my keys, practically threw myself inside. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors. My breathing was ragged. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at the trail entrance. I expected something to come out. Someone. But nothing did. The forest just stood there, silent, watching. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spitting under my tires. I didn't slow down until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I found some shoes and a torn-up backpack? That I got lost for a moment, even though I was sure I had gone the right way? That I thought, just for a second, that someone was out there, following me? No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believed myself. But I haven't hiked alone since, and I never will again.